The night her father died, every clock in the shop stopped. 3 months later, Clara had one final notice before losing everything he left behind. The silence in the gear and glass was never truly silent. To anyone else, the shop would have felt like a tomb of brass and mahogany, but to Clara, the silence had a texture. It was a heavy, suffocating fabric woven from the ghosts of 1,000 mechanical heartbeats that had stopped ticking the night her father died. Clara leaned over the workbench, the jeweler's loupe pressed against her eye socket. Her world was reduced to the diameter of a quarter-inch, a landscape of microscopic gears and hair-thin springs. The air here smelled of stale bergamot tea, aged linseed oil, and the sharp metallic tang of iron filings. It was a scent that had lived in her hair and under her fingernails since she was 6 years old, a permanent mark of her lineage. She held her breath, her tweezers hovering over a balance wheel. Her hands, usually steady as stone, betrayed a microscopic tremor. Tick. She froze. It wasn't the clock in front of her. It was the radiator. Or perhaps it was just the phantom rhythm her brain projected into the stillness. Her father, Elias, used to say that a clockmaker doesn't listen with their ears, but with their pulse. If your heart is racing, Clara, the timing will be fast. You have to be the anchor for the machine. But how could she be an anchor when the ground was being pulled from beneath her? Clara set the tweezers down and exhaled, the sound loud in the cavernous shop. She reached for the letter sitting on the corner of the scarred oak table. The paper was expensive, thick cream-colored cardstock that felt like a slap in the face. It didn't belong among the grease-stained manuals and rusted parts. Final notice of foreclosure. The words were printed in a sharp, modern font that seemed to vibrate with predatory intent. The developer, a subsidiary of Vane Industries, wasn't interested in the history of the shop. They didn't care that the eternal movement clock, her father's unfinished masterpiece, sat under a shroud in the corner like a grieving widow. They wanted the land. They wanted the prestige of the corner lot, to build another glass and steel monolith that would reach for the sky while crushing everything beneath it. Clara stood up, her joints popping. She was 26, but in the dim light of the shop, surrounded by the remnants of the 19th century, she felt ancient. She looked at her reflection in a tarnished silver mirror on the wall. Her face was smudged with oil, her dark hair pulled back in a messy knot that was losing the battle against gravity. Her eyes, a deep, tired amber, looked back at her with a flicker of something that wasn't quite hope, but a stubborn, jagged refusal to break. "I won't let them take it, Dad," she whispered. The shop didn't answer. The 300 clocks on the walls remained frozen, their hands pointing to a dozen different wrong times, a symphony of stilled moments. She grabbed her coat, a worn canvas jacket that had belonged to Elias, and shoved the letter into her pocket. She didn't have a plan, only a destination. Vane Industries, the fortress of the man they called the Glacier, and the transition from the cobblestone streets of the old district to the financial center was a descent into a different kind of cold. The air in Midtown Manhattan felt filtered, stripped of its soul. The Vane building rose 60 stories into the gray November sky, a jagged needle of blue glass. Clara felt like a smudge of oil on a pristine white canvas as she pushed through the revolving doors. The lobby was a cathedral of minimalism. The floors were white marble, polished to such a high gloss that she could see the frayed hems of her jeans reflected beneath her. "I'm here to see Silas Vane," she said to the receptionist, a woman whose skin looked as though it had been airbrushed into existence. The woman didn't look up from her screen. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, I have a debt. Or rather, he has a debt to history." The receptionist finally looked up, her gaze skating over Clara's oil-stained jacket and the smudge of carbon on her cheek. "Mr. Vane doesn't see anyone without an appointment, especially not walk-ins." Tell him Clara Thorne is here. Tell him I'm the owner of the property on 4th and Vine. The one his lawyers are trying to steal." There was a flicker of something in the receptionist's eyes. Pity, perhaps, or just annoyance. She pressed a button on her console and spoke softly. A moment later, her expression shifted to one of pure shock. 55th floor, the woman said, her voice dropping an octave. "The private elevator is to your left." The ride-up was silent. There was no music, no mechanical hum, only the sensation of gravity pressing down on Clara's shoulders. When the doors opened, she was met with a floor that felt more like a private residence than an office. The lighting was low and warm, but the temperature was kept at a precise, bone-chilling 64 degrees. And then she heard it. Tick, tick, tick. It wasn't a phantom. It was real. The hallway was lined with clocks, not the digital monstrosities she expected, but authentic handcrafted antiques. A Louis XIV mantel clock, a Japanese lantern clock, a rare Harrison sea watch in a vacuum-sealed case. They were all perfectly synchronized. The sound was rhythmic, mathematical, and utterly devoid of warmth. At the end of the hall, behind a desk of black obsidian, sat Silas Vane. He didn't look like a glacier. He looked like a man carved from the very shadow he sat in. His suit was charcoal, his shirt a crisp, blinding white. He was leaning over a series of documents, a fountain pen in his hand, moving with the precision of a surgeon. He didn't look up as she entered. "You have 3 minutes, Miss Thorne," he said. His voice was a low baritone, smooth and cold as a frozen lake. "And I suspect 2 of those will be spent on anger." Clara walked to the edge of his desk, her boots leaving faint, dusty prints on the dark rug. "I'm not here to be angry, Mr. Vane. I'm here to be practical. You're tearing down a block of history to build a parking garage. My shop has been there for 80 years. My father's work—" "Your father's work was exquisite," Silas interrupted, finally looking up. Clara stopped mid-sentence. His eyes were a piercing, unsettling blue, the color of deep ice where the light doesn't reach. He wasn't looking at her face, he was looking at her hands. Elias Thorne was the last master of the triple-axis tourbillon, Silas continued, his voice devoid of inflection. His death was a loss to the horological world. But his daughter's inability to manage a balance sheet is not a reason for me to halt a $300 million development. Clara felt the heat rise in her neck. "It's not about the money. It's about the legacy. You have a hallway full of clocks, Mr. Vane. You clearly value time. How can you be the one to kill the place where time is kept alive?" Silas set his pen down. He moved with a terrifying economy of motion. He stood up and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling window looking out over the city. "Time isn't kept alive, Miss Thorne. It is merely measured. And currently, your time has run out. You owe the bank $400,000 in back taxes and predatory loans your father took out in his final year. I didn't create your debt. I simply purchased it." "Why?" she spat. "Why us?" He turned back to her, and for a split second, the glacier mask cracked. Just a hairline fracture, but she saw it. A flash of something that looked like recognition, or perhaps a deep, abiding hunger. "Because I need something," he said. "And you are the only person in this city with the hands to provide it." He walked back to his desk, but he didn't sit. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather-bound folder. He slid it across the obsidian. "The Vane Board of Directors is concerned with my image," he said, the word image sounding like a foul taste in his mouth. "They believe I am too detached, too cold to lead the public transition of the company. They want a humanizing element, a wife, someone who represents tradition, roots, and the soul of the city." Clara stared at the folder. "You want a fake marriage." "I want a contract," Silas corrected. 1 year. You will live in my home. You will attend 5 major events. You will provide the optics of a man who has found balance. And in exchange, Vane Industries will pay off every cent of your debt. The gear and glass will be designated a historical landmark, protected from development in perpetuity. I will also provide a grant for you to finish your father's eternal movement clock. All expenses paid. Clara felt the room tilt. It was a pact built on desperation, wrapped in the promise of her father's dream. She looked at Silas, this man who spoke of marriage like a corporate merger. "Why me?" she whispered. "You could hire an actress. You could find a socialite who actually knows how to wear a dress." Silas stepped closer. He was tall, looming over her, smelling of sandalwood and something sharper, like ozone before a storm. "Because you don't know how to lie, Miss Thorne. And because I know that for that shop you would walk through fire." Clara looked down at the desk, her heart hammering against her ribs. She reached out to touch the folder, but her gaze was caught by Silas's wrist as he adjusted his cuff. Her breath hitched. The watch was encased in brushed platinum, but the face was unmistakable. The hand-painted celestial dial, the unique sweeping motion of the second hand that mimicked a heartbeat. It was the Ethelgard chronograph, her father's watch, the one he was wearing the night the shop was robbed. The night he was found slumped over his workbench, his heart stopped, the watch gone. The world went silent, truly silent this time. The ticking of the clocks in the hallway faded into a dull roar in her ears. "Where did you get that?" Clara asked, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with a cold, sharp realization. Silas followed her gaze. He didn't pull his sleeve down. He didn't flinch. He simply stood there, the platinum watch catching the dim office light. "It was a gift," he said softly, "from a long time ago." Clara looked from the watch to the man who was offering to save her, the man who wore her father's legacy like a trophy. She felt a sickening pull in her chest, a mixture of visceral hatred and a desperate clawing need to know the truth. If she walked away, the shop died. Her father's memory faded into a parking lot. If she stayed, she was entering the lion's den. She picked up the fountain pen. It was heavy, made of cold silver. "1 year," she said, her voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. "But I want access to your entire collection, and I want to know the history of every piece you own." Silas watched her, his expression unreadable. "Agreed." Clara signed the bottom of the contract. The ink was black, wet and final. As she pulled the pen away, Silas reached out. For the first time, his skin brushed hers. His hand was surprisingly warm, burning almost against her cold fingers. It was only a second of contact, but a jolt went through her, an electric current of tension that made her pull back. "Welcome to the family, Clara," Silas said. He didn't smile. He didn't look triumphant. He looked like a man who had just sentenced himself to something he couldn't take back. He turned toward the window again, the Ethelgard watch ticking on his wrist, the sound of it echoing in the quiet office like a countdown. Clara stood there, the contract a heavy weight in her hand, realizing that she hadn't just saved her shop. She had just stepped into a clockwork trap, and the gears were already beginning to turn. Leaving the gear and glass felt like leaving a limb behind. Clara spent the final hours before the Vane Industries town car arrived, packing a single battered leather valise. She didn't pack many clothes, mostly thick sweaters and worn jeans, but she spent an hour meticulously wrapping her father's specialized tools. The escapement files, the brass hammers, the jars of Mobius oil, and the loop she had used since she was a child. She stood in the center of the workshop one last time. The smell was a heavy cloak of comfort, iron, dust, and the faint, sweet scent of the pipe tobacco her father had smoked for 40 years. She reached out and touched the shroud covering the eternal movement clock. It felt cold, stagnant. "I'm coming back for you," she whispered to the empty room. The car that picked her up was a silent black predator that glided through the rain-slicked streets of the city. The driver didn't speak, He simply held the door open, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere over Clara's shoulder. As they left the familiar, crumbling brick of the old district and climbed toward the exclusive heights of the Westchester Hills, the world changed. The chaos of the city was replaced by a manicured, terrifyingly perfect silence. The Vane estate, known locally as the Kronos House, sat at the end of a long, winding driveway lined with ancient, leafless oaks. It wasn't a home, it was a fortress of glass and charcoal-colored stone. The architecture was sharp, all right angles and cantilevered roofs that seemed to defy gravity. When the car stopped, the front door of the mansion opened. Silas Vane stood framed in the light of the foyer. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket now. He stood in a crisp white shirt, with the sleeves rolled up exactly 2 turns. Clara stepped out of the car, her boots crunching on the gravel. The air up here was thinner, smelling of wet pine and stone. She felt the weight of Silas's gaze before she reached the steps. "You're late," he said. His voice didn't hold anger, only a flat mathematical observation. Clara checked her own wrist, a simple functional Timex. "By 3 minutes, Mr. Vane. The rain, traffic is a variable that should be accounted for," he interrupted, turning his back to her and walking inside. "Mrs. Gable will show you to your quarters. Dinner is at 7, exactly." Clara followed him into the foyer and stopped dead. The walls were white, a shade so pure it made her eyes ache, but they were almost entirely covered in clocks. Tall cases, wall-mounted regulators, intricate cuckoos from the Black Forest, and sleek modern chronometers. But as Clara scanned the room, a chill that had nothing to do with the Westchester air crept down her spine. The pendulum of a massive 7-foot-tall mahogany grandfather clock was motionless. The hands of a delicate French porcelain clock were frozen. Clara walked to the nearest one, an English bracket clock from the 1790s. The time showed 11:14. She moved to the next. A ship's chronometer in a brass housing, 11:14. She spun around, her eyes darting from face to face across the room. Every single clock in the massive foyer, over 30 of them, was stopped at the exact same moment. "Why?" she whispered, the word echoing in the cavernous space. "They are not for time-telling," a voice said from the shadows of the hallway. Mrs. Gable, a woman with a face like crumpled parchment and eyes that seemed to see through Clara's very skin, emerged into the light. "Mr. Vane prefers things to be consistent. Accuracy is a burden, Miss Thorne. Stillness is a choice." "But it's a graveyard," Clara said, her voice trembling. "A clock that doesn't tick is just a box of dead metal." Mrs. Gable didn't respond. She took Clara's valise with a strength that belied her age. "This way. Your room is in the east wing. Mr. Vane is in the west. You are not to enter the west wing without an invitation, and you are never, under any circumstances, to go into the basement." Clara followed the woman up a floating glass staircase. The house felt like a laboratory. There were no photographs on the walls, no stray books, no signs of life other than the rhythmic, distant hum of the climate control system. Her room was large, overlooking the dark woods. It was decorated in shades of grey and slate. On the nightstand sat a single, small travel clock. Clara walked over to it. It, too, was stopped at 11:14. She reached out, her fingers itching for her tools. With a practiced flick of her fingernail, she popped the back casing. The movement was pristine. It didn't need repair. It had been intentionally jammed. Someone had placed a tiny silver pin through the gears to lock them in place. She sat on the edge of the bed, the silence of the house pressing against her ears like deep water. She thought of Silas's wrist, the Ethelgard watch. That watch had been ticking. It was the only heart beating in this entire house of glass. At 6:55, Clara changed into a clean sweater, a deep forest green that made her amber eyes pop, and headed downstairs. She found the dining room, a long, narrow space dominated by a table of polished obsidian that mirrored the one in Silas's office. Silas was already there, sitting at the head. He was reading a digital tablet, but as she entered, he set it aside. He watched her walk the length of the room. "You smell of linseed oil," he said as she sat down. Clara stiffened. "I was packing my tools. The scent doesn't wash off easily." Silas didn't look disgusted. If anything, he looked unsettled. He flared his nostrils slightly, his gaze dropping to her hands, which she had folded in her lap to hide the faint grease stains under her nails. "It's a nostalgic smell," he said, his voice dropping an octave, "but out of place here." "A lot of things are out of place here, mister." "Vain," Clara said, leaning forward. The candlelight reflected in the black table, making it look like they were floating over a void. "Why are the clocks stopped? You told me you valued my father's work. You wear his watch. But you've turned your home into a mausoleum for time." Silas's hand, which had been reaching for his water glass, went perfectly still. The Ethelgard watch peeked out from under his cuff. Tick, tick, tick. In the silence of the room, the sound was deafening. "I don't wear your father's watch because I value time, Clara," he said, using her name for the first time. The sound of it made a strange heat bloom in her chest. "I wear it because it is the only thing I have ever found that refuses to lie." "Clocks don't lie. People do." "Did. Clocks lie every second," Silas countered, his eyes locking onto hers. "They tell you that time is moving forward. They tell you that things are changing. But for some of us, time stopped a long time ago. These clocks," he gestured to the hallway, "are simply more honest than the rest of the world. They admit they have nowhere to go." Mrs. Gable entered with the first course, a chilled leek soup. The clinking of the spoons against the porcelain was the only sound for several minutes. The tension between them was physical. A taut wire stretched across the table. Clara wanted to scream, to demand he tell her where he got the watch, to ask him if he knew the fire that had taken her father. But she remembered her father's advice. When a gear is stuck, don't force it. Observe the surrounding parts. Find the tension point. Silas was the tension point. "You said you had a collection," Clara said, breaking the silence. "You promised me access." "I did. I want to see the workshop. I want to see the pieces that aren't on the walls." Silas wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, his movements slow and deliberate. "The library contains the archival pieces. You may spend your days there. My assistant will deliver the eternal movement from your shop tomorrow. You can work on it in the conservatory. It has the best light." "And the basement?" Silas's eyes sharpened. The blue in them seemed to turn to flint. "The basement is off limits. There are structural issues, hazardous materials. You are a guest and a partner in a contract, Clara. Do not mistake that for a license to wander." "What are you hiding down there, Silas? More dead clocks?" He stood up abruptly. The chair didn't scrape against the floor. It moved silently on the thick rug. He leaned over the table, his face inches from hers. She could smell the sandalwood of his cologne, and beneath it something sharper, the smell of old paper and ozone. "I am hiding nothing," he said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "I am protecting what remains. Finish your dinner. Tomorrow we have a press event at the Metropolitan Museum. You will need to look the part of a woman who is happy to be here." He turned and walked away, his stride long and certain. Clara sat in the dark dining room, the cold soup forgotten. She waited until she heard his footsteps fade into the west wing. Then she stood up and walked into the hallway. She didn't go to her room. She followed the scent of the house, the way the air moved. She found the door to the basement in a small alcove behind the kitchen. It was heavy oak, reinforced with a modern electronic keypad. She placed her hand on the wood. It was vibrating. It wasn't a mechanical vibration. It was a sound, a deep, resonant hum that she felt in her teeth. Tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. It wasn't one clock, it was hundreds, thousands. Deep beneath the glacier's feet, something was alive, something was beating. Clara pressed her ear to the door, her heart racing. The sound was a symphony of perfectly timed movements. It was the sound of a world that hadn't stopped at 11:14. She looked at the keypad. 6 digits. She thought of the watch. She thought of her father. She thought of the man who looked like he was made of ice, but smelled like the things he claimed to hate. She reached out and pressed the first number. 1, then 1, then 1, then 4. The keypad beeped, a sharp red sound of denial. "Not tonight, Miss Thorne," a voice whispered. Clara whirled around. Mrs. Gable was standing at the end of the dark corridor, her shadow stretching long and thin across the white walls. "Mr. Vane is a man of many layers," the old woman said, her voice sounding almost like a warning. "Some of them are there to keep people out, but most of them are there to keep the ghosts in. Go to bed. The sun rises early for those who have to pretend." Clara fled to her room, but she didn't sleep. She spent the night by the window, watching the shadows of the trees. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the Ethelgard watch. Tick, tick, tick. She realized then that Silas Vane wasn't the glacier. He was a man holding his breath, waiting for a gear to catch. And she was the only one who knew how to make it turn. The eternal movement arrived on a Tuesday, encased in a crate of raw pine that smelled of the Pacific Northwest and transit. It sat in the center of the conservatory, a glass-walled cathedral of ferns and white orchids that Silas had designated as Clara's sanctuary. The morning sun was sharp, cutting through the glass in long, dusty, slanted bars, illuminating the millions of dust motes dancing over the wood. Clara stood before the crate with a crowbar in her hand. Her chest felt tight, a physical pressure that made it hard to draw a full breath. This was her father's ghost. For 3 years, she had kept it under a tarp in the back of the shop, too afraid to touch it, too broke to buy the materials needed to finish it. Now, it was here, in the heart of the enemy's fortress. She jammed the crowbar into the seam. The wood shrieked, a jagged, violent sound that tore through the curated silence of the estate. "Careful with the escapement," a voice said. Clara jumped, the crowbar slipping and clattering onto the marble floor. Silas was standing in the doorway. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His white sleeves were rolled up, and for the first time she saw the sheer physical power in his forearms and the scars. Faint, jagged lines of white tissue that looked like they had been etched by fire. "I know how to open a crate, Mr. Vane," she said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I don't doubt your skill," Silas said, stepping into the room. He didn't stop until he was inches from the crate. He didn't look at Clara. He looked at the wood. "I doubt your state of mind. You're shaking." "I'm not," Clara started, but she looked down at her hands. They were trembling. She dropped the crowbar and knelt, pulling the pine boards away by hand. As the shroud fell away, the eternal movement was revealed. It was a tower of brass, silver, and gold, nearly 4 feet tall. It didn't have a traditional face. It was a skeletonized marvel of engineering, a chaotic but harmonious web of gears, flywheels, and mercury-filled tubes designed to compensate for temperature fluctuations. It was supposed to be a clock that never needed winding, a machine that could theoretically run for 1,000 years. But at the very top, where the final escapement wheel should have been, there was a void, a single, empty spindle. Silas knelt beside her. The scent of him, sandalwood and that sharp ozone-like cold, mingled with the smell of the pine. He reached out, his long, elegant fingers hovering just a fraction of an inch from the brass. "The third wheel is missing its pitch," Silas murmured. He wasn't speaking to her. He was speaking to the machine. Your father was trying to solve the problem of friction by using a diamagnetic suspension, wasn't he? Clara stared at him, her mouth slightly open. How do you know that? That was his secret. He never published the schematics for the eternal movement. Silas finally looked at her. His blue eyes were no longer icy. They were dark, swimming with a technical intensity that was almost frightening. Because time isn't just measured, Clara. It's conquered. Your father understood that friction is the enemy of immortality. He was trying to build something that could outlast grief. He stood up abruptly, the glacier mask sliding back into place. The tools you requested have been placed in the drawers. Mrs. Gable will bring you tea. I expect you to be ready by 6. We have the gala at the Metropolitan Museum. Silas, she called out as he turned to leave. He stopped, his back to her. The Ethelgard watch, she said, her voice a low, steady blade. The one you're wearing. It has the same diamagnetic escapement. My father only ever made 2 of them. One was for the Sultan of Brunei. The other he wore every day of his life. How did you get it? The silence in the conservatory grew heavy, the air feeling thick as syrup. Silas's shoulders tensed. He didn't turn around. I told you, he said, his voice like grinding stone. It was a gift, and like all gifts in this world, it came with a price I am still paying. He walked away, leaving Clara alone with the skeleton of her father's dream and 1,000 questions that felt like gears grinding without oil. The Metropolitan Museum of Art was a sea of black ties, silk gowns, and the hollow clinking of champagne flutes. It was a world of performance, and Clara felt like an imposter in her midnight blue silk dress. The fabric was heavy, shimmering like deep water, and it felt restrictive after a lifetime of canvas work jackets. Silas was at her side, his hand resting firmly on the small of her back. His touch was a constant burning reminder of the contract. To the cameras, it looked like a gesture of possessive affection. To Clara, it felt like he was holding her steady so she wouldn't bolt. Smile, Clara, Silas whispered, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. The CEO of Meridian Bank is watching. He needs to believe you're the reason I've stopped firing people by email. Maybe I'm just the reason you've started hiding your coldness better, she shot back, forcing a radiant, fake smile for a passing photographer. The difference is academic, he replied. They moved through the great hall, a choreographed dance of nods and hollow pleasantries. Silas was a master of it. He spoke in perfectly modulated tones, his face a mask of aristocratic boredom. But Clara noticed the small things. She noticed the way his thumb rhythmically stroked the silk of her dress, a nervous tick he probably wasn't even aware of. She noticed the way he stayed clear of the catering staff, carrying flaming hors d'oeuvres. Then it happened. To celebrate the opening of the new wing, a small indoor pyrotechnic display was triggered. It was supposed to be a waterfall of light cascading from the balcony. The whoosh of the ignition and the sharp, acrid scent of magnesium flare filled the hall. The light was blinding, a sudden, violent white that turned the shadows into jagged knives. Silas froze. It wasn't a subtle hesitation, it was a total system failure. His hand on Clara's back tightened until it was painful. His breath hitched, a wet, ragged sound that was swallowed by the applause of the crowd. Clara looked up at him. His face was bloodless. His pupils were blown wide, black voids in the center of his blue eyes. He wasn't in the museum anymore. He was somewhere else, somewhere hot. Somewhere loud, somewhere where the air was thick with the smell of burning oil. Silas, she whispered. He didn't hear her. He was staring at the fading sparks on the floor, his chest heaving in short, shallow bursts. Silas, look at me. She stepped in front of him, breaking the fake posture of a socialite. She grabbed his hands. They were ice-cold and slick with sweat. Count the seconds, she said, her voice sharp and grounding. She took his thumb and pressed it against her own pulse point on her wrist. Listen to the beat. 1, 2, 3. It's just light, Silas. It's just light. The crowd was beginning to notice. Whispers started to ripple through the nearby guests. Is he all right? The glacier looks like he's melting. Clara didn't care about the optics anymore. She leaned in, her forehead almost touching his. Silas, look at me. We're in the museum. The clocks are all stopped at 11:14, remember? Nothing is burning. You're safe. He blinked. The focus returned to his eyes, slow and agonizing. He looked at Clara, really looked at her, and for a second the mask was gone entirely. What was left was a boy, terrified and lost in a world of gears that wouldn't turn. He gripped her hands back, his knuckles white. Clara, he breathed, her name a broken plea. Let's go, she said. She led him through the crowd, her head held high, her expression a perfect shield of, my husband is feeling unwell. She didn't stop until they were in the back of the silent town car, the doors muffled against the noise of the city. For 10 minutes, Silas said nothing. He sat in the corner of the leather seat, his head back, his eyes closed. The only sound was the rhythmic tick, tick, tick of the Ethelgard watch on his wrist. Clara watched him, her anger at the contract, at the mystery, at the glacier persona beginning to erode. She saw the tremor in his hands. She saw the way he clutched the watch, as if it were an anchor keeping him from drifting into a void. You were there, weren't you? She asked softly. Silas didn't open his eyes. Where? The fire. The night my father died. The night the shop burned. Silas's jaw tightened. I was in many fires, Clara. My life has been one long incineration. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting tonight. He opened his eyes and looked out the window. The coldness was back, but it felt different now. It didn't feel like a weapon. It felt like a bandage wrapped too tight around a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. They returned to the estate in total silence. Silas went straight to the West Wing without a word. Clara, unable to sleep, her mind a whirring engine of theories, went to the library. She needed to lose herself in something technical, something that made sense. She pulled a heavy volume from the shelf, a rare 19th-century treatise on horological escapements. As she sat in the oversized leather chair, the book felt heavy in her lap. She flipped through the pages, the smell of old paper and leather grounding her. Near the back of the book, the binding felt stiff. She frowned and ran her fingers along the spine. Something was tucked inside. She carefully pried it loose. It was a photograph. It was old. The edges curled and yellowed with age, but the image was clear. It was her father, Elias Thorne. He looked younger, his hair more salt than pepper, wearing his grease-stained apron. He was standing in front of the gear and glass, a rare smile on his face. But it was the person next to him that made the air vanish from Clara's lungs. A small boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, stood beside Elias. He was thin, his face smudged with oil, wearing a pair of oversized goggles around his neck. He was looking up at her father with a look of pure, unadulterated worship. The boy's eyes were a piercing, unmistakable blue, and in the boy's hand was a small brass gear. Clara's heart stopped. She looked at the date scrawled on the back of the photo in her father's elegant, slanted script. October 12th, the apprentice and the master. The date was exactly 1 year before the fire. She stared at the boy in the photo, at the young Silas Vane. He hadn't been a stranger. He hadn't been a predatory developer who had stumbled upon her shop by accident. He had been there. He had been a part of her father's life, and yet, in all the years she had lived in that shop, her father had never once mentioned a boy named Silas. Clara looked at the photo, then up at the dark, silent hallway that led to the West Wing. If Silas had been her father's apprentice, why did he let the shop fall into ruin? Why did he pretend he didn't know her? And most importantly, if he loved her father enough to look at him like that, why was he wearing the watch that should have been in her father's grave? She stood up, the photo clutched in her hand. The silence of the house no longer felt like a choice, it felt like a conspiracy. She walked toward the west wing, her bare feet silent on the cold marble. She didn't care about the rules anymore. She didn't care about the contract. She reached the heavy mahogany doors of Silas's private study. A thin sliver of light escaped from beneath the door. She raised her hand to knock, but she stopped. From inside the room, she heard a sound. It wasn't the sound of a glacier. It wasn't the sound of a CEO. It was the sound of someone weeping, a low, jagged, choked-back sound of a man trying to dismantle a grief that had been ticking inside him for 20 years. And then the sound of metal hitting metal. Cling, cling, cling. Silas was working. Clara leaned her head against the door, the photograph pressed against her chest. She realized then that she wasn't just living with a stranger. She was living with a man who was haunted by the same fire that had consumed her life. And the eternal movement wasn't just a clock. It was a countdown to a truth that was going to destroy them both. The morning after the museum gala, the Vane estate felt as though it had been vacuum-sealed. The watery November sun struggled to penetrate the triple-paned glass of the breakfast nook, casting long, pale rectangles across the obsidian table that seemed to vibrate with a low-frequency hum. Silas was already there, but the man Clara had seen in the car, the man who had gasped for air and clutched her hand like a lifeline, was gone. In his place sat the glacier. He was dressed in a navy suit, so dark it was almost black, his tie knotted with a mathematical precision that made Clara's own throat feel tight. He didn't look up from his tablet. He didn't acknowledge the way she lingered in the doorway, the photograph from the library, a heavy, jagged secret in her pocket. "The car is coming at 10, Silas said, his voice as flat as a dial tone. "I have a mandatory meeting with the board in London. I'll be back in 48 hours. Clara took her seat, her movements stiff. "London? You're leaving now? After last night?" Silas finally looked at her. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, beautiful, distant, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Last night was a lapse in oxygen, nothing more. Mrs. Gable has the schedule for your fittings and the delivery of the specialized alloys you requested for the eternal movement. Stay in the conservatory. Do not wander." "You're running away," she said softly. The corner of Silas's jaw twitched. It was the only sign that her words had landed. "I am managing a global entity, Clara. I don't have the luxury of running. The house is secure. The staff is instructed. Do your work." He stood up, the chair making no sound on the heavy rug. He didn't look at her again as he walked out, but as he passed, the scent of him, that ozone and sandalwood, trailed behind like a ghost. Clara waited until she heard the heavy thud of the front door and the crunch of gravel as the car pulled away. She waited another hour. She sat in the conservatory, staring at the eternal movement, the brass skeleton of her father's dream. But she wasn't thinking about the missing escapement. She was thinking about a small boy with oil on his face and goggles around his neck. She stood up, her heart beginning a slow, heavy rhythm. Mrs. Gable was in the kitchen, the distant clinking of silver the only sound in the house. Clara moved toward the back alcove, her bare feet silent on the marble. She stood before the basement door. The heavy oak felt cold, a barrier between the world of the living and whatever Silas was keeping in the dark. She looked at the electronic keypad. 1114 had failed. She closed her eyes, trying to think like her father. Elias Thorne didn't believe in random numbers. He believed in the geometry of time. He believed that everything in the universe had a frequency. She pulled the Ethelgard photograph from her pocket. She looked at the date on the back. October 12th, 10 to 12. She reached out and pressed 1012. A soft, mechanical click echoed in the hallway. The red light on the keypad turned a steady, pulsing green. The door didn't swing open. It unlatched with the heavy, pressurized hiss of a vault. Clara pushed it. The air that hit her didn't smell like a basement. It didn't smell of damp earth or stagnant dust. It smelled of high-grade machine oil, ozone, and the sharp, metallic tang of a soldering iron. It was the smell of her childhood, amplified 1,000 times. She descended the stairs, each step lit by recessed floor lights that flickered on as she moved. As she reached the bottom, the sound hit her. It wasn't a tick, it was a roar. Thousands of clocks covered the walls of the cavernous underground space. But unlike the dead clocks upstairs, these were alive. Every single one was in a state of perfect rhythmic motion. The sound was a physical weight, a shimmering golden wall of noise that vibrated in her marrow. But as she walked deeper into the room, she realized the truth. None of them were showing the current time. Each wall was a different year. One section showed the time in 1998, another in 2004. They were all running, their pendulums swinging in a frantic, desperate attempt to keep those years alive. In the center of the room stood a circular workbench, lit by a halo of industrial LED lamps. It was a masterpiece of ergonomics, filled with tools that Clara had only ever seen in catalogs: laser alignment levels, vacuum-sealed oiling stations, and a microscopic lathe. And there, in the center of the bench, sat the heart of the mystery. It was a small, velvet-lined box. Inside lay a single gear. It was carved from a translucent pale blue material she didn't recognize, a synthetic sapphire alloy, perhaps. Its teeth were cut with a precision that defied the human eye. It was the missing escapement wheel for the eternal movement. Clara reached out, her hand trembling. She didn't touch it, but she felt the phantom pull of it. Silas wasn't just a collector, he was a master. He had finished what her father couldn't. He had spent years, perhaps decades, perfecting the technology to complete the clock Elias had died for. "It's a diamagnetic suspension wheel," a voice said from the shadows. Clara whirled around, her heart leaping into her throat. Silas was standing at the base of the stairs. He wasn't in his suit. He was in a simple black sweater, his hair slightly disheveled, his face pale. He hadn't gone to London. He had never left. "You lied," she breathed, her voice barely audible over the roar of the clocks. "I gave you an opportunity to stay in the light, Clara," Silas said. He walked toward the bench, his movements slow and predatory. "But you've always had a talent for finding the shadows." "The photo," Clara said, pulling it out and slamming it onto the workbench between them. "You were his apprentice. You were the boy in the shop. My father loved you. He called you the apprentice on the back of this picture. Why did you hide it? Why did you pretend you were just some corporate shark who bought my debt?" Silas looked down at the photo. His expression didn't change, but his hand, resting on the edge of the bench, tightened until the knuckles were white. "Because the boy in that photo died in the fire, Clara," he said. "And the man who walked out of the embers didn't deserve to be known by Elias Thorne's daughter." "He was wearing the watch," Clara shouted, gesturing to his wrist. "The Ethelgard. He was wearing it when they found him. How did you get it, Silas? Did you take it from his wrist while the shop burned? Did you leave him there so you could have his secrets?" The air in the room seemed to freeze. The ticking of the thousands of clocks suddenly felt like a countdown to a collision. Silas stepped forward, crossing into the circle of light. The glacier was gone. In its place was a raw, jagged fury. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip firm but not bruising. "I didn't take it from him," Silas hissed, his face inches from hers. "He gave it to me. He pushed me into the floorboards, Clara. He told me to keep the time. He told me to find you. And then he went back into the back room to save the schematics for the movement. He never came out." Clara froze. The roar of the clocks faded into a dull, distant hum. "He saved you?" "He died for me," Silas whispered, his voice breaking. He let go of her shoulders and slumped against the workbench, his head in his hands. "Every clock in this house, every dollar I've made, every company I've gutted, it was all for the single purpose of finding the pieces of the movement that were stolen that night. I've spent 20 years hunting the men who set that fire. I've spent 20 years trying to be a man who was worth the life your father gave up." He looked up at her, his eyes wet and shining with a terrifying vulnerability. "And you were the one thing I couldn't fix. I watched you from the shadows for years. I saw you struggling in that shop, and I knew that if I just gave you the money, you'd never look at me. I had to bring you here. I had to make you hate me so I could at least keep you safe." Clara felt the world tilting. The contract, the coldness, the glacier. It was all a shield. A massive, elaborate piece of clockwork designed to protect her from a truth he thought would break her. She looked at the sapphire escapement wheel on the bench. "You finished it." "I tried," Silas said, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "But I realized I couldn't put it in, because if I finish the clock, the mission is over. And if the mission is over, I don't have a reason to stay near you anymore." He reached out, his fingers hovering near her cheek, but he didn't touch her. The restraint was agonizing. "The contract ends in a year, Clara. I thought that would be enough time to make things right, but time is a cruel master." "Silas." Before she could say more, a sharp, rhythmic beeping cut through the air. It was the security system. Silas's face went stone cold instantly. He turned to the monitors on the wall. A black SUV was parked at the gate. Men in dark coats were stepping out. "They found us," Silas said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "The men from the fire. They've been looking for the movement as long as I have." He turned to Clara, his eyes wide with a sudden, sharp terror. "Get in the vault, behind the 1998 wall, now." "I'm not leaving you," she said, her voice steady. "Clara, this isn't a business deal anymore," he said, grabbing the sapphire gear and shoving it into her hand. His skin was burning hot against hers. "This is the reason I'm alive. Go!" He shoved her toward the hidden door, just as the sound of a window shattering echoed from upstairs. Clara stood in the darkness of the vault, the sapphire gear clutched to her chest, listening to the man she thought was a monster prepare to fight the ghosts of her past. The darkness inside the vault was not absolute. It was a thick, velvety indigo, smelling of old paper, cold stone, and the faint, persistent scent of Silas, sandalwood and sharp ozone. Clara pressed her back against the cool metal of the 1998 wall. The sapphire gear clutched so tightly in her palm that the sharp edges of its teeth bit into her skin. She welcomed the pain. It was the only thing that felt real. Outside the vault, the world was ending. The rhythmic wall-to-wall symphony of the basement clocks had been interrupted. The sound of heavy tactical boots on the glass stairs above was a jagged violation of the sanctuary. There was a crash, the sound of a workstation being overturned, the shatter of high-end horological glass, and then a voice. "You've spent a lot of money to play with toys, Silas." The voice was thin, reedy, and carried the effortless cruelty of a man who had never faced a consequence he couldn't buy his way out of. Clara held her breath, her heart hammering so hard she feared the sensors in the wall might pick it up. "Get out of my house, Julian," Silas said. His voice was different now. It wasn't the glacier speaking to a board of directors, nor was it the broken man who had wept behind a mahogany door. It was a voice made of iron and ash. It was the voice of the boy who had survived the fire, finally grown into the monster he needed to be to protect what was left. "Your house?" Julian laughed, a sound like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "This house was built on my father's investments, and that clock upstairs, the one you've been restoring, belongs to the estate of Vane and Thorn. My father was the Vane, Silas. Your father was just the hired help who got greedy." Clara's eyes widened in the dark. Vane and Thorn. The names on the old shop signs she remembered from her earliest childhood, before the letters had been scraped away and replaced by only the Gear and Glass. She had always assumed Vane was just a brand. "Your father didn't invest," Silas spat. "He predated. He waited until Elias was at his most vulnerable. Then he tried to steal the patents for the diamagnetic movement. When Elias wouldn't sign, your father did what he always did. He cleared the board." "And yet you're the one wearing the Ethelgard," Julian said, his voice closer now. Clara could hear the soft clink of a weapon being readied. "Give me the watch, Silas, and give me the wheel. We know you finished it. We've been watching the power surges from this basement for months." "I'll give you nothing," Silas said. The sound of the struggle was sudden and visceral. A grunt of pain, the heavy thud of a body hitting a workbench, and the frantic, chaotic tick-tick-tick of 1,000 clocks suddenly out of sync as their vibrations were disturbed. Clara couldn't stay in the dark. The sapphire gear felt like a burning coal in her hand. If Silas died, the truth died with him. If Silas died, the boy who had been pushed into the floorboards would finally be consumed by the fire he had spent 20 years running from. She found the release lever, a small mechanical override her father had taught her to look for in every locked space. "Every cage has a heartbeat, Clara. You just have to find the pulse." The 1998 wall slid open with a hiss of pressurized air. The basement was flooded with harsh white light. Silas was pinned against the circular workbench, his lip bleeding, his navy sweater torn at the shoulder. 3 men in tactical gear stood around him, but it was the man in the center, Julian, who held the power. He was older, his face a map of expensive surgeries and shallow greed, holding a silenced pistol aimed directly at Silas's chest. "Clara, no!" Silas roared, his eyes finding her instantly. The terror in his voice wasn't for himself. It was the sound of a man watching his last reason for living walk into a trap. Julian turned, his eyebrows arching in amusement. "Ah, the daughter. The legacy herself. You look just like him, you know." Elias had that same look of misplaced stubbornness right before the end. Clara stepped out of the vault, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. She didn't look at the gun. She looked at Silas. She saw the way he was trying to shield the workbench with his body, even now. "The fire," Clara said, her voice steady, cold. 11:14. That wasn't when the shop started burning, was it? Julian smiled. "Sharp girl." "It was the time on the Ethelgard watch," Silas whispered, his gaze never leaving Clara's. "The watch stopped at 11:14 when the first blow fell. My father, Julian's father, hit Elias with a lead pipe. The crystal shattered, the movement jammed. 11:14 was the moment the music died." "And Silas here," Julian added, "was supposed to be the witness, but he was a coward. He hid. And Elias, in his infinite, pathetic wisdom, decided to save the coward instead of the clock." "He didn't save a coward," Clara said, stepping closer, her hand opening to reveal the sapphire gear. The pale blue light of the synth sapphire caught the overhead LEDs, shimmering like a captured star. "He saved the only person who was capable of finishing his work. He saved the man who would spend 20 years building a fortress to keep the shadows away from me." Julian's eyes locked onto the gear. Greed, pure and animalistic, flickered in his pupils. "The wheel. Give it to me, and maybe the glacier gets to keep his life, as a contract, of course." Clara looked at the gear, then at the eternal movement monitors on the wall. The digital schematics were flashing, a countdown. Silas had initiated a purge. He was going to destroy the data, the workshop and everything in it to keep the technology out of Julian's hands. "The 11:14 clocks upstairs," Clara said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They aren't just monuments, are they, Silas? They're the sequence." Silas's eyes widened, a microscopic nod. Clara turned to Julian. "You want the gear? Catch!" She didn't throw it to him. She threw it toward the massive 7-foot mahogany clock at the base of the stairs, the one Silas had called the anchor. As Julian's men scrambled for the sapphire, Clara didn't run for the exit. She ran for the workbench. "Silas, the override!" she screamed. Silas reacted with the instinct of a master horologist. He didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for the central spindle of the workbench. Together, their hands met over the brass gears. The touch was electric, not the fake performance of the gala, but a desperate, bone-deep synchronization. 11:14, she whispered. They turned the central dial together, passing the markers. 11, 12, 13. At exactly 14, a resonant low-frequency hum erupted from the floor. The basement clocks didn't just tick, they began to chime in unison, a deafening harmonic wall of sound that vibrated the very air molecules in the room. It was a sonic pulse, a frequency designed by Elias Thorne to jam the delicate sensors of any electronic device in the room. The tactical lights flickered and died, the red lasers on the pistols vanished. In the sudden rhythmic darkness, Silas moved. He was no longer the CEO. He was the boy who knew every shadow of a workshop. He used the momentum of the heavy brass flywheels to disarm the nearest man, his movements a blur of calculated violence. Clara dived for the floor, her hands finding the heavy iron wrench she had spotted earlier. She didn't think. She acted. She jammed the wrench into the primary drive gear of the house's elevator system, locking the intruders in the basement. "The stairs!" Silas shouted, grabbing her hand. They bolted up the glass steps as the sound of the harmonic chime reached a crescendo. Behind them, the eternal movement schematics on the monitors dissolved into static. They burst through the heavy oak door and into the foyer. The house was screaming with the sound of the clocks. Every frozen hand on every wall was vibrating. The silver pins Silas had used to jam them finally snapping under the sheer force of the resonance. They didn't stop until they were outside, standing on the gravel driveway in the freezing November rain. Clara gasped for air, the cold water soaking through her green sweater, her chest heaving. She looked back at the house, the glass fortress that had been her prison and her sanctuary. The lights were flickering, a dying heartbeat. Silas stood beside her, his breath coming in ragged plumes of white. He was bleeding from his temple, his hands scraped and raw. He turned to her, the rain slicking his hair back, making his blue eyes look like deep, dark pools of midnight. He reached into his pocket. He held out his hand. In his palm sat the sapphire gear. He had snatched it back in the chaos. "It's over," he said, his voice trembling. "The data is gone. The project is dead. Julian has nothing but a basement full of noise." Clara looked at the gear, then up at Silas. The glacier was gone. The contract was a charred ruin in the back of her mind. All that was left was the truth. "Why 11:14, Silas?" she asked, her voice small against the roar of the rain. "You said the watch stopped then. But why did you pin every clock in the house to that moment? Why did you make yourself live in a graveyard?" Silas stepped closer, the heat radiating from his body in the cold air. He reached out, his hand cupping her jaw, his thumb brushing away a stray drop of rain. "Because at 11:14, your father looked at me," Silas whispered, his voice breaking with 20 years of unshed tears. "He told me that his life was a clock that had run its course, but mine was just beginning. He told me that time isn't a gift, Clara. It's a debt, and I spent every second since then trying to pay it back to you. I stopped the clocks because I didn't think I deserved to move forward until you were safe, until you knew that you weren't alone. Clara closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. The anger, the suspicion, the grief, it all dissolved into the sound of the rain. She realized then that the fake marriage hadn't been a trap for her. It had been Silas's way of finally letting his own heart beat again. "The watch is still ticking," she said, opening her eyes. Silas looked down at his wrist. The Ethel guard was still there, its celestial dial glowing faintly in the dark. "It's the only one that survived the fire," he said. "The only thing that kept the rhythm." "No," Clara said, taking his hand and pressing it against her own heart. "It's not the only one." In the silence of the rain-swept driveway, they stood together, two broken gears finally finding their pitch. The house behind them was dark, the eternal movement was lost, and the shadows were still waiting in the wings. But for the first time in 20 years, the time was no longer 11:14. It was the beginning of the rest of their lives. The sirens arrived not as a rescue, but as a punctuation mark. Blue and red light fractured against the rain-slicked glass of the Vane estate, turning the glacier's fortress into something garish and temporary. Julian and his men were led out in silence, their high-tech ambition dismantled by a symphony of brass and the stubborn refusal of a daughter to let go of the past. Silas stood by the black SUV, his shoulder slumped, the adrenaline of the fight replaced by a hollow, ringing exhaustion. He didn't watch them leave. He was looking at the sapphire gear in his hand, the pale blue light of it almost translucent in the early morning grey. "The contract is upstairs, Silas," Clara said, her voice raspy from the cold. She was wrapped in his oversized wool coat, the scent of sandalwood and rain-dampened earth enveloping her. "I can go get it. We can burn it here, in the driveway." Silas turned to her. The bruises on his face were darkening, but the ice in his eyes had finally melted, leaving behind a deep, soulful blue that saw her with a clarity that was almost painful. "The contract was a ghost's idea, Clara," he said softly. "I thought I could buy my way into the light. I thought if I controlled the variables, the shop, the debt, the marriage, I could force the world to be right again. But you can't force a clock to keep time if the mainspring is broken. You have to wind it." He stepped toward her, the gravel crunching under his boots, a solid, real sound. He took her hand, not with the possessive grip of a CEO, but with the reverence of a man holding something fragile and priceless. He pressed the sapphire gear into her palm. "I'm not staying here," he said. "This house. It was a tomb for 1114. I don't want to live in a tomb anymore." "Where will you go?" Silas looked toward the horizon, where the city glowed like a bed of dying coals. "To the only place where the air smells like the truth." The return to the gear and glass was a homecoming of ghosts and dust. It was 3 in the morning when the black car pulled up to the curb of the old district. The streetlights were flickering, casting long, wavering shadows across the brickwork. Clara unlocked the door, the heavy iron key turning with a familiar, comforting resistance. Inside, the shop was exactly as she had left it. The smell of linseed oil, the rows of silent clocks, the heavy oak workbench where her father had lived his life. Silas followed her in, carrying the eternal movement frame. He moved through the cramped, oil-stained space with a strange grace, as if he remembered every floorboard that creaked. He set the brass skeleton down on the central bench, right under the hanging industrial lamp. "It's cold in here," Clara whispered. "It's perfect," Silas replied. They didn't speak of Julian, or the legal battle that Silas's lawyers would dismantle by morning. They didn't speak of the fake marriage or the scandal that would inevitably ripple through the financial world. Those were variables. This, the metal, the oil, the heartbeat of the machine, was the constant. Clara lit the small pot-bellied stove in the corner. The crackle of the wood and the orange glow of the fire began to eat away at the damp chill. Silas shed his expensive suit jacket, tossing it onto a chair without a second glance. He rolled up his sleeves, exposing the scars on his forearms to the warm light. "The third wheel," Clara said, pointing to the void at the top of the tower. Silas nodded. He picked up a set of tweezers, her father's tweezers, and held the sapphire gear. "The pitch has to be perfect. If the diamagnetic suspension is off by even a micron, the friction will eventually consume the movement. It will stop." "It won't stop," Clara said, stepping beside him. For the next 4 hours, the world outside the brick walls ceased to exist. There was only the eternal movement. They worked in a rhythmic, unspoken harmony that defied their months of distance. Silas held the tension of the mainspring while Clara adjusted the ruby bearings. She guided the sapphire gear into place while he calibrated the magnetic field with a handheld sensor. Their hands brushed, metal against skin, oil against oil. It wasn't the electric jolt of the museum gala. It was a steady, grounding warmth. It was the feeling of 2 parts of a mechanism finally finding their alignment. "Ready?" Silas asked, his voice a low vibration in the quiet shop. Clara took a deep breath. She reached for the primary winding key, a heavy brass piece shaped like a clover. On 3. 1, 2, 3. Clara turned the key. The sound was a deep, resonant whir, the sound of 20 years of tension being released. The flywheels began to spin, their motion so smooth they looked like solid discs of gold. The sapphire gear caught the light, spinning in its magnetic cradle, untouchable by friction, unbothered by time. And then, the sound. It wasn't the sharp tick-tock of a standard clock. It was a low, melodic thrum, a heartbeat that seemed to resonate through the floorboards and into their very bones. Thrum-hum, thrum-hum, thrum-hum. Clara looked at the face of the clock. The hands didn't jump. They moved in a single, continuous, sweeping motion. The time was 11:15. The silence of 11:14 was over. Clara felt a sob catch in her throat, not of grief, but of a profound, shattering relief. She looked up at Silas. He was staring at the clock, tears carving tracks through the oil and dust on his cheeks. He looked like the boy in the photograph again, the apprentice who had finally finished the master's work. "He was right," Silas whispered, his gaze moving from the clock to Clara. "He told me time wasn't a gift. He said it was the space we create for the people we love." He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the side of Clara's face. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone, leaving a faint smudge of grease. He didn't pull away this time. He didn't retreat into the ice. "I spent 20 years trying to be worthy of the life he gave me," Silas said, his voice breaking. "I thought I had to be perfect. I thought I had to be the glacier so I wouldn't burn everything down again. But the only thing that ever mattered was coming back here. To you." Clara leaned into his palm, her eyes closing. The sound of the eternal movement was a warm blanket around them. "You were always here, Silas. In every clock I fixed, in every gear I polished. I was looking for the person who remembered him the way I did." She opened her eyes and looked at the mantelpiece above the stove. There, sitting in a simple wooden box, was the Ethelgard watch. Silas had taken it off. It wasn't on his wrist anymore. It wasn't a shackle of debt or a trophy of survival. It was just a watch. "The contract is over," Clara said. "I know," Silas replied. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "I don't want a contract, Clara. I want the friction. I want the noise. I want every messy, unpredictable second of a life that actually moves forward." "Then stay," she whispered. "The shop needs an apprentice. And I think I know a man who's been practicing for 20 years. Silas let out a jagged, breathless laugh. He pulled her into his arms, holding her with a fierce, desperate tenderness. They stood in the center of the gear and glass, surrounded by the ghosts of their past, but for the first time, the ghosts were quiet. Outside, the sun began to rise over the old district, the first light of a new day catching on the brick and the glass. The city began to wake up, the sounds of distant traffic, the cry of a morning bird, the world beginning its chaotic, beautiful dance. But inside the shop, the time was perfect. The eternal movement ticked on, its sapphire heart beating in a rhythm that would never stop, a testament to a father's love and a daughter's resilience. And Silas Vane, the man who had tried to stop the world at 11:14, finally let go of the key. He didn't need to hold the time anymore. He finally had enough of it. He leaned down and kissed her, a kiss that tasted of salt, oil, and the promise of 1,000 tomorrows. The glacier was gone. The clockmaker's daughter was home, and the clock on the wall, for the first time in 20 years, moved to 11:16.